Lightning split the sky over Highway 99 West at 9:14 on a Thursday night, and in the half-second of white light it produced, I saw the toolbox sitting on the ground beside my truck, and I saw her face when she read the name on it. She had been standing in the rain watching me work, not impatiently, in the specific way of someone who had assessed the situation and decided that watching was the most useful thing available to her. The BMW had been on the shoulder for 40 minutes by then, hazards blinking in the Pacific storm that had arrived that afternoon, and that was doing what Pacific storms did when they arrived, which was become everything. The rain and the wind and the particular gray-black of a November Oregon night when the weather had decided it was the only thing that mattered. I had stopped because the BMW was there, and I was there, and stopping was what you did. She had lowered the window 2 inches when I knocked. I had told her I was a mechanic. She had told me a tow truck was coming. I had told her in this weather the tow truck was 90 minutes away, and I was already here. She had looked at me through the 2-inch gap with the specific rapid calculation of someone deciding whether to trust a stranger in a storm, and she had decided, and the window had come down the rest of the way. I had the problem diagnosed in 11 minutes. Failed fuel pump control module, the specific failure mode of that BMW generation in cold, wet conditions, the kind of thing that a dealership found in 3 hours with a diagnostic computer, and that I found in 11 minutes because a man named James Ashton had spent 4 years teaching me to listen to engines rather than interrogate them. I had gone to the truck for the replacement module and come back with my toolbox. The toolbox was a snap-on rolling chest, vintage 1980s, red, with the accumulated scratches and dents of decades of serious use. It had been James's before it was mine. He had given it to me 9 years ago when I opened my shop, and he had said his name stays, and the name had stayed, and I had carried it every day since through every job in every weather on every road in the Portland area, and it had never been anything other than what it was, which was a toolbox with a dead man's name on it. Except I had not known he was dead. I had set the toolbox on the wet asphalt beside the BMW. I had been reaching for the socket set when the lightning came. It illuminated the highway and the rain and the toolbox simultaneously, and in the white light the white paint marker letters were stark and clear, and she read them. J. Ashton. She said, "Where did you get that toolbox?" Her voice had changed. Not dramatically. She was not someone who did things dramatically. I understood this about her within the first 60 seconds of meeting her, and the following weeks confirmed it. But the voice had changed in the way that voices changed when the person using them had just encountered something that reorganized other things, when the present moment had reached back and touched something in the past, and the touching had changed the shape of both. I looked at the toolbox. I looked at her. I said, "Why?" She said, "That name. J. Ashton. James Ashton." I said, "He was my mentor. He gave me the toolbox in 2015. She put both hands on the roof of the BMW and stood in the rain and looked at the white letters on the red chest. She said, "James Ashton is my father." I said, "I know who you are." She said, "He's been missing since October 2019. The rain came down the way Oregon rain came down in November, not in drops but in sheets, in the continuous quality of water that had decided the ground was where it was going, and that was going there without interruption. I said, "I know." She said, "Tell me everything." I met James Ashton in the spring of 2007. I was 21 years old, and I had been working at Roy Lester's garage in southeast Portland for 8 months. My first real mechanic job after 2 years of community college automotive programs and a year of the specific wandering that young men did when they understood what they were good at, but had not yet found the place where being good at it meant something. Roy Lester's garage was a small shop on Division Street that Roy had been running since 1989, and that had the specific quality of places that had been doing the same honest work in the same location for a long time. The smell of it, the organization of it, the way the regular customers knew where to park and knew Roy's name and Roy's dog's name, and that Roy did not oversell and did not underdeliver, and that this had been true since before most of them were driving. Roy had taken me on because I could do the work, and because I was willing to learn what I did not yet know how to do, which was the combination Roy had been looking for. He had 2 other mechanics and a front desk person and a backlog that suggested he needed a 4th set of hands, and my hands had been available. James Ashton had retired from his own shop on Hawthorne 2 years before I arrived at Roy's. Ashton Auto and Machine had been a Portland institution for 30 years. The kind of shop that people drove across the city to use because the work was honest and the prices were fair, and James Ashton himself would come to the counter and look you in the eye and tell you exactly what your car needed and nothing more. He had sold the shop in 2005 and had retired to what he called selective usefulness, which meant he came into Roy's 2 days a week, consulted on the difficult cases, and went home at noon. He had been 55 years old when I met him. I had been 21. The arithmetic of the gap between us should have made us irrelevant to each other. It did not. What happened instead was the specific thing that happened between people who had the same relationship to the same kind of work. The recognition, wordless and immediate, that the other person understood what you understood about why the work mattered and how it was supposed to be done. I had felt it the first time I saw James look at an engine. The specific quality of attention he brought, the listening quality, the way he did not impose a diagnosis but received one. I had asked him about it on my 3rd day. I had said, "How do you know what to look for before you've run any diagnostics?" He had looked at me with the look that turned out to be characteristic of him, the look that assessed whether the question was genuine or performative, and that, having determined it was genuine, gave the question the full weight of his attention. He had said, "I don't look for anything, I listen." I had said, "To what?" He had said, "To the car. The car will tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen. Most mechanics don't listen. They diagnose. Listening and diagnosing are not the same thing." I had thought about this for the rest of that day. The following morning I had come in early and I had stood in front of a 1998 Honda Accord that had come in with an idle problem, and I had listened. I had not touched it, had not connected a diagnostic tool, had simply started the engine and stood there and listened. And I had heard it. The specific irregular quality of the idle that was not the fuel injector problem the previous mechanic had assumed, and was instead the vacuum leak that became obvious when you listened for it rather than tested for it. I had gone to find James. He had come and listened for 30 seconds and said, "East side of the intake manifold. Small leak. Clean it and reseal, and you're done." He had said it the way he said everything, simply, without inflation, as a statement of what was true. I had said, "How do you hear something that specific?" He had said, "You practice listening, same as anything." Over the following 4 years, working alongside James 2 mornings a week, I had practiced listening, not just to engines, to everything, to the customer describing the problem, because the customer's description contained information that the diagnostic computer could not access, to the specific sounds that different failure modes produced, and the way those sounds changed over time, and the way the change told you something about the rate of progression, and whether you had days or weeks, or whether the car needed to come off the road today. James had given me the listening the same way good teachers gave things, not by instruction primarily, but by demonstration, by being present while doing the thing in the way it was supposed to be done, and trusting that the watching would teach more than the telling. The second thing he gave me was the standard. He said it once, directly, in my 2nd year, and he said it in response to a specific situation rather than as a general principle, which was why it stuck. I had been tempted to charge a customer for work that had taken me longer than expected, because I had made the wrong first assumption and gone down the wrong path before correcting myself. The extra time was real. The customer had not caused it. I had been considering whether the customer should pay for my mistake. James had been at the next bay. He had said, without looking up from what he was doing, "Never charge for work you didn't do, never skip work you were paid to do, the rest takes care of itself." I had looked at him. He had said, "You were about to charge that man for your first hour." I had said, "You weren't looking." He had said, "I don't have to look. I know what that pause sounds like." The customer had paid for the work I had done, and not the hour I had wasted. The rest had, over 17 years, taken care of itself in exactly the way James had said it would. The reputation for honesty had built the business that honesty made sustainable. The third thing he gave me was the toolbox. He gave it to me in 2015 when I opened Colby Auto and Machine in the same neighborhood where I had apprenticed, 3 blocks from Roy's place, in a small commercial space that had been a tire shop, and that I had converted over 3 weekends into a functional one-man operation. James had come to the opening. Not a party, an opening, which meant he walked in one morning and looked at the setup with the critical assessment of a man who had set up a shop before and who knew what good and insufficient looked like. He had approved of most of it. He had suggested 2 changes in the tool organization and 1 change in the lift positioning. I had made all 3 changes before the end of that day. And then he had gone to his truck and come back with the snap-on chest. I had said, "James," he had said, "I don't need it. You do. Take it." I had said, "It has your name on it." He had said, "I painted my name on it 30 years ago so nobody would take it at a job site. My name stays. You carry it." I had carried it for 9 years. Patricia died in January 2018. She had been diagnosed with mixed connective tissue disease in 2016, a rare autoimmune condition in which the immune system attacked the body's connective tissue, producing a combination of symptoms that overlapped with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and other conditions, and that was difficult to treat because it moved between phases and did not respond consistently to the treatments that worked on its individual components. She had managed it for 2 years with the specific determined competence she brought to everything. Not in denial, she had understood exactly what she had, and she had made informed decisions about treatment, and she had been present for Rose, and present at the shop, and present in our life in a way that the disease wanted to prevent and that she had not allowed. The disease had been faster than the managing in the end. She died in January 2018. Rose was 2 years old. I had kept the shop open, not because the shop was more important than the grief, but because the shop was where James had taught me that work done correctly was its own form of integrity, and that integrity required showing up, and showing up was the thing I had available to give in the months after Patricia died when I did not have very much else. Rose had grown up in the orbit of the shop the way children grew up in the orbit of the thing their parent did when the parent had no one to leave them with, and when the thing was safe enough for a child to be near. My mother, Vivian, had been the essential presence, the person who showed up every morning and stayed every evening, and who had made possible the specific ordinary continuity of a household that had lost its center and that needed a center while a new one was being established. Rose had heard about James from the time she could understand stories. Not hagiography, the specific honest version of a mentor that a person told when the mentor was real, and the gratitude was real, and the lessons were real. She knew the 3 things. She could recite them in order. She had a quality of attention that I chose to believe she got from me, but that I suspected she might have constructed independently because some children simply arrived with it. She had asked me once, when she was 7, if Mr. James was going to come back. I had said I did not know. She had said she hoped so. I had said me too. That conversation had been a year before the November storm that put Mara Ashton's BMW on the shoulder of Highway 99 West. James had disappeared in October 2019. He had called me in late September of that year, the last time I spoke to him, and the call had had a quality that I had noticed and filed and had not known what to do with. Not distress. Something different from distress. The quality of someone who had arrived at a decision after a long period of working toward it and who had the specific calmness of that arrival. The settling that occurred when the question you had been carrying for a long time had finally been answered. I had asked him how he was. He had said he was well, better than well. He had used the word settled. I had asked what that meant. He had said he had some unfinished business he was addressing, and that it felt right to be addressing it. I had asked what kind of unfinished business. He had paused. He was not a man who paused. He answered questions directly and moved on. The pause told me something about the weight of what he was not saying. He had said, "Old business, 40 years old. I should have addressed it sooner. I'm addressing it now." I had said, "Is everything all right?" He had said, "Everything is more than all right. I'll tell you about it when there's more to tell." He had said he was going to the coast in October. The Cannon Beach trip. He took it every year, 3 days, no phone, the specific annual solitude of a man who needed the coast the way some people needed mountains. He had not come back from the coast. The cabin had been found empty and undisturbed. His car in the lot. James himself nowhere. The Clatsop County Sheriff had investigated. An investigator hired by Mara had investigated. I had told both of them everything I knew. The September call, the old business, the settled quality of his voice. Neither investigation had produced a conclusion. James Ashton had become one of the missing, not dead by any evidence, not alive by any trace, simply gone in the specific terrible way that certain disappearances resolved into permanent uncertainty. For 5 years I had carried the uncertainty alongside the toolbox. Every time I opened the top drawer and saw the name, I thought about the September call and the word settled and the unfinished business he had been addressing and the coast that had taken him and not returned him. I had not been able to grieve cleanly because there was nothing clean to grieve. I had not been able to stop grieving because there was no resolution that ended it. I had carried it the way you carried things that had no designated place in the emotional vocabulary. Not quite grief, not quite hope, the specific weight of someone who was present in your life every day through the work and the lessons and the name on the toolbox and who was simultaneously somewhere unknown. I finished the module installation at 9:38, 24 minutes in the rain on the shoulder of Highway 99W, with the storm doing what it was doing, and Mara Ashton standing beside me asking questions and me answering them. She had asked about the September call. I had told her everything I remembered about it. The word settled, the old business, the 40 years old, the more to tell when there's more to tell. She had listened with the complete stillness of someone who was fitting pieces into a structure that had been incomplete for 5 years. She had said, "He had a son." I had not known what to say. She had said, before my mother, before me, in 1973, a son who was placed for adoption. My mother told me after he disappeared. She said he had been looking for the son for 2 years before the coast trip. The rain had been what it was. The highway had been what it was. I had been standing on the shoulder of the road in the dark holding a socket wrench and understanding what James's old business had been. She had said, "He went to the coast to find him. I think he found him. And then something happened." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "You knew him. You knew what he was like. Tell me honestly, does this sound like him?" I had thought about James, about the specific quality of a man who did not leave things undone if he could address them, who settled accounts and kept promises, and who had said in September that he was addressing something he should have addressed sooner. About the specific patience of someone who had waited 40 years to find a son, and who had then, at 67 years old, decided that waiting was over. I had said, "Yes, it sounds exactly like him." She had looked at the toolbox. She had said, "He gave you the toolbox." I had said, "In 2015. He said his name stays." She had said, "It does." The BMW started on the first turn of the key. We had stood in the rain for another few minutes, exchanging numbers, the specific exchange of people who understood that the conversation was not finished and that finishing it required a different context than a highway shoulder in a November storm. She had said, before she got in the car, "Thank you for stopping." I had said, "Of course." She had said, "Not for the car, for everything." I had driven home with the rain on the windshield and James Ashton in my thoughts in the way he had been in my thoughts for 5 years, which was constantly and without resolution. Vivian was at the kitchen table when I got home. Rose was asleep. Vivian had the specific quality of someone who had heard a car in the driveway at 10:30 and who had decided not to go to bed because 10:30 in a storm meant something had happened and she had wanted to be at the table when I came in. She looked at me when I came through the door. She said, "You're wet." I said, "I stopped for a car on 99W. She said, "And?" I sat down across from her and told her. She listened the way she had always listened to significant things, without interruption, with the specific quality of attention that I had always believed was where my own quality of attention had come from, the source of the thing before James had reinforced it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at the toolbox in the corner. It lived there, had lived there for 9 years, too important to leave in the truck and too much a part of the household to put in the garage. Rose had grown up with the toolbox in the corner of the kitchen the way other children grew up with a clock or a plant, a fixed point of the room. Vivian said, "So he went to find his son." I said, "Yes." She said, "And something happened on the way home." I said, "We don't know yet, but yes, that's what it looks like. She said, 5 years. I said, yes. She said, all this time, and the answer was on the coast. I looked at the toolbox, at the white letters that I had looked at thousands of times over 9 years, and that had meant James, and that now meant James going to find his son and James on a coastal road in October, and the specific terrible gap between those two things. I said, she wants to know. She's going to work with her investigator, and she's going to use what I told her. Vivian said, will it be enough? I said, I don't know. It's more than they had. She said, Dean. I said, yeah. She said, he gave you that toolbox in 2015. He said his name stays. I said, yes. She said, he trusted you to carry his name. You carry it correctly by finding out what happened to him. That's what carrying it means. I looked at my mother across the kitchen table on a November night with the rain still going outside and the toolbox in the corner and 9 years of carrying a name that had just, on a highway in a storm, led somewhere. I said, yes, that's what it means. 3 weeks later, Mara called. The investigator had taken the information about the adopted son and the September call and the old business and had worked with it. He had found a man named Thomas Grady, born 1973, living in Astoria, Oregon, approximately 35 miles north of Cannon Beach, not far from where James had disappeared. Thomas had been adopted at birth and had spent his adult life looking for his biological family. He had found James Ashton through a genealogy service in the summer of 2019, and they had made contact in August of that year. James and Thomas had met in person in September 2019, the same month James had called me, the month of the word settled, the month of the old business being addressed. Thomas Grady had known James for 2 months before the disappearance. He had known what happened. James had come to Astoria in October 2019, not for the Cannon Beach camping trip, but to spend 4 days with Thomas. 4 days with the son he had not known for 46 years. Thomas had a family, a wife, 2 children. James had met all of them. Thomas had described the 4 days to the investigator as some of the most significant days of his life. James had left Astoria on the morning of October 19th to drive back to Portland. The coastal highway between Astoria and the route back to Portland had sections of poor visibility and rain conditions. October 19th, 2019 had been a rainy day. James's car had gone off the road on a curve approximately 20 miles south of Astoria. His body had been recovered by the Coast Guard 6 weeks later from a cove below the cliff edge. The identification had been made incorrectly in the initial processing. A clerical error at the medical examiner's office that had assigned the remains to a John Doe case rather than matching them against the missing person report. The error had been identified and corrected in 2021, but the notification had been mailed to an address James had listed on old paperwork, and that was no longer the correct address for anyone in the Ashton family. James Ashton had not been missing. He had died. He had died on the road home from his son. Mara told me all of this on a December afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she had accepted when I offered it, and that she held in both hands the way people held warm things when they needed something to hold. She had come in person, not a call. She had called to ask if she could come, and I had said yes, and she had come. Rose was at school. Vivian had given me the kitchen on purpose, the specific maternal gift of space when space was what was needed. Mara had told me about Thomas Grady and Astoria, and the 4 days and the road home and the cliff and the Coast Guard and the medical examiner's error and the notification that had gone to the wrong address. I had listened the way James had taught me to listen, completely, without interruption, receiving the information before responding to it. When she finished, I did not say anything for a moment. The toolbox was in the corner where it had always been. I said, "He found him." She said, "Yes, he found him. He had 4 days with him and his family." I said, "And he was driving home." She said, "Yes." I thought about the September call, the word settled, the quality of arrival that I had noticed and filed. James had been settled because he had found his son and had made a plan to spend time with him, and the long question of the son had become something he was addressing, and that was nearly resolved. He had resolved it. He had been driving home. I said, "What did Thomas say? About the 4 days?" She said, "He said my father was—" She stopped for a moment, the specific stop of someone managing something. She continued. He said my father was happy, genuinely happy. He said he talked about Portland, about his old shop, about the years at Roy's garage. She looked at the toolbox. She said, he talked about a young mechanic he had trained who had opened his own place, who was doing good work, who he was proud of. I looked at the white letters, J. Ashton, in paint marker, in careful block letters. She said, he was talking about you. I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, he never told me he was proud. He wasn't a man who said that directly. She said, no, he wasn't. I said, he showed it differently. She said, yes. We sat in the kitchen with the December afternoon outside and the toolbox in the corner and the coffee going cold in her hands. After a while she said, I want to meet Rose. I said, she's been hoping he would come back so she could meet him. She knows the 3 lessons. Mara said, the 3 lessons? I told her, the car will tell you what's wrong if you're willing to listen. Never charge for work you didn't do. Never skip work you were paid to do. The toolbox is your name. She listened to all 3. She said, he said the first one to me when I was 7, about suppliers, about listening to what the freight system was telling you instead of assuming you already knew. I said, he could apply it to anything. She said, he applied it to everything. She put the coffee cup down on the table. She said, I'm going to bring Thomas to Portland, when he's ready. I don't know when that will be. We've been talking and it's new for both of us, but I want him to see the toolbox. I said, yes. She said, he should see it. I said, yes. She said, our father's name on a toolbox that's been in a mechanic's kitchen in Portland for 9 years, being carried. I said, he told me his name stays. She said, it did. She looked at the corner of the kitchen where the red snap-on chest had been sitting since 2015, with the name painted on the front in careful white letters by a man who had wanted to make sure no one took it from him at a job site, and who had not known, when he painted it, that the name would end up being carried by someone he had not yet met, who would meet his daughter on a highway in a storm 29 years later. She said, my father would have liked this. I said, which part? She said, all of it, the storm, the module, the toolbox, the way it found me. I said, he believed that the right things found each other if you didn't rush them. She said, yes, he did. Rose came home from school at 3:15. She came through the door with her backpack and her specific after-school energy, which was considerable, and she stopped when she saw that I was not alone. I said, Rose, this is Mara Ashton. Rose looked at Mara. She said, Ashton, like Mr. James. Mara said, he was my father. Rose looked at the toolbox in the corner. She looked at the J. Ashton on the front. She looked at Mara. She said, did you come to hear about him? Mara said, I came to hear about him and to tell your dad some things. Rose dropped her backpack on the floor and sat down at the kitchen table with the specific directness of a 9-year-old who had decided she was part of this conversation. She said, I know the 3 lessons. Mara said, can you tell me? Rose told her. In order, precisely. With the slight additional weight she gave the 3rd one, which was the one about the toolbox, which she had always found the most interesting because it was the one she could see every day in the corner of the kitchen. When she finished, Mara said, he taught you those? Rose said, he taught my dad. My dad taught me. Mara looked at me. She said, that's how it works. I said, yes. Rose said, did he teach you things too? Mara said, he taught me to listen. He said you could listen to a freight system the same way you listen to an engine. He said the system would tell you what was wrong if you were willing to hear it. Rose thought about this. She said, same lesson. Mara said, same lesson. Rose said, he must have really believed it. Mara said, he really believed it. Rose looked at the toolbox. She said, I'm glad his name stayed. Mara said, so am I. The December afternoon was outside doing what December afternoons did in Portland. The specific gray soft quality of a Pacific Northwest winter afternoon that was not dramatic, but that had depth. The particular light of a city that had decided that gray was not the absence of something, but a color in its own right, with its own character and its own beauty. Vivian came in from the living room and put the kettle on without being asked, which was the specific Vivian way of joining a conversation without imposing on it. The four of us sat in the kitchen, Vivian and Rose and Mara and me, with the toolbox in the corner and James Ashton's name on the front of it in white paint marker and the specific quality of an afternoon that had more in it than afternoons usually had. The lessons had traveled from James to me to Rose. The name had traveled from a job site in 1985 to a kitchen in Portland in 2024. The work had been done correctly. The rest had taken care of itself. Yet before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there someone who gave you something, a skill, a standard, a way of working or seeing, that you have been carrying without fully knowing how far it would reach? Sometimes the things we are given travel further than we understand when we receive them. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.